The mountain groaned before it died. Celia Underwood heard it first, a deep, resonant crack that split the morning air like a rifle shot fired by God himself, and she spun around on the narrow ledge where she had been crouching with her rock hammer and field notebook, her brown eyes snapping wide. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. The Caspar Mountain Pass stretched behind her, 1,000 feet of wagon-rutted trail carved into the Sierra Nevada rock, and in the space of 3 thundering heartbeats, she watched the entire eastern face of the ridge collapse. Stone met stone. Dust swallowed the sky. The roar was so enormous it became silence in its own way, a pressure wave that knocked Celia off her feet and sent her sliding 2 yards along the ledge before her fingers found purchase in a granite fissure, and she held on until the world stopped shaking. When the dust began to settle, the pass was gone. Not blocked, not damaged, gone. 40 feet of trail buried under perhaps 8,000 tons of fractured granite, limestone, and the crushed bones of the mountainside itself. The kind of geological events Celia had written papers about, had theorized about, had measured precursor tremors for, the kind she had tried to warn Territorial Governor Aldous Crane about 3 weeks ago, when she had ridden into Carson City with her survey maps and her seismic readings, and her carefully documented evidence that the Caspar Pass was sitting on a fault line that was overdue, dangerously overdue, for a catastrophic failure. Governor Crane had not listened. Governor Crane had laughed. And now, on the far side of that wall of rubble, stranded in the direction of Nevada Territory with no way to get back through, was the Hartwell Wagon Company, 63 settlers, 11 wagons, 4 months of provisions, and Wallace Whitfield, the trail boss who had hired Celia 6 weeks ago because his previous surveyor had broken both legs falling from a horse outside of Reno. Wallace Whitfield, who had spent the first 2 weeks of this journey making it abundantly clear that he believed a woman geologist was the most useless thing the frontier had ever produced. Wallace Whitfield, who was going to need her more desperately right now than he had ever needed anything in his life. Celia pressed herself flat against the ledge, breathing hard, dust coating her lips and the back of her neck, her notebook somehow still clutched in her left hand. She had been on this side of the pass for exactly 40 minutes, having risen before dawn to take rock samples from an outcropping she had noticed yesterday, a formation of shale and rhyolite that had confirmed every single one of her worst suspicions about this section of the Sierra Nevada. She was alone. The settlers were on the far side of a mountain that had just swallowed the only road anyone in the Hartwell Company knew about. But Celia Underwood had been studying these mountains for 3 years, and she knew something that nobody else in this valley knew, something she had mapped out in precise detail during a solo survey expedition the previous summer, something she had written up and submitted to the United States Geological Survey Office in Washington with a cover letter that was still, presumably, sitting unread in some government bureaucrat's filing cabinet. She knew where the alternate route was. She just had to get back to the wagons first. To understand how any of this had come to pass, you had to go back to the morning in Reno, Nevada Territory, in the 3rd week of August in the year 1872, when Celia Underwood had walked into the offices of the Hartwell Wagon Company with a leather satchel full of geological survey maps, and a disposition that had been sharpened by 3 years of being underestimated into something very close to iron. She was 28 years old. She had graduated from the University of Michigan's scientific program, not as an official student because they did not accept women, but she had sat in every lecture for 4 years, read every textbook, completed every examination, and earned the informal acknowledgement of Professor Elias Drummond, the foremost geologist in the American West, who had eventually hired her as his field assistant, and then, upon his retirement in 1870, had handed her his survey contracts and his reputation in a single remarkable afternoon. "You know more about Western geology than any man I have trained," Drummond had told her, and Celia had thanked him, And then she had gone outside and stood in the Nevada sun for a long time, feeling the weight of what it meant to be given something wonderful in a world that would spend every single day trying to take it back. She had been doing survey work for 2 years on her own by the time she arrived at the Hartwell Company offices. Her work had helped the Central Pacific Railroad route 3 sections of line. She had identified 2 silver deposits that had subsequently been successfully mined. She had published 3 papers in Eastern geological journals under the name C.E. Underwood, and not one of the editors had realized they were corresponding with a woman. None of that would have impressed the first man she met at the Hartwell Company offices, whose name was Gerald Prout, and who was the company's operations manager, a red-faced man of about 50, with suspenders that strained across his chest, and a way of looking at her that made Celia feel like a peculiar species of insect. "The surveying position," she said, placing her card on his desk. Gerald Prout looked at the card, he looked at her, he looked at the card again. "C. Underwood," he read. "Celia, yes. You're a woman." "I am," she confirmed. "I don't think. I have mapped 47 miles of the Sierra Nevada in the past 18 months, she said. "I have documents showing that the Caspar Pass route you intend to take has significant geological instability in the eastern section. I have alternate route proposals, and I have a letter of professional endorsement from Professor Elias Drummond, whose survey work made this territory navigable for the last decade. Would you like to see any of those things, or would you prefer to have a conversation about my gender?" Gerald Prout opened and closed his mouth. That was approximately the moment that the door to the inner office opened and Wallace Whitfield walked out. She noticed him the way you notice a change in the weather, not because you were looking for it, but because the atmosphere simply shifted, and you found yourself aware of it whether you wanted to be or not. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than performance of it, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with very strong opinions. He wore trail clothes, worn canvas trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, worn leather boots, and he had a survey map of his own rolled under one arm, which told Celia that he at least understood the basic concept of looking at the ground before you walked on it. He looked at her. He looked at Prout. He looked at her card, which Prout was still holding. "This the new surveyor?" he asked. "Now, Wallace," Prout started. "Celia Underwood," Celia said, looking directly at Wallace Whitfield because she had learned very early that the way to handle men like this was to aim straight for the center of the target rather than tiptoeing around the edges. "I specialize in Sierra Nevada geological formations. I believe your current route has a significant problem." Something moved in Wallace Whitfield's eyes. Not dismissal, not yet anyway. Closer to appraisal, which was at least a step up from immediate rejection. "What kind of problem?" he asked. "The kind that involves 8,000 tons of rock and a fault line that is 3 years past its expected failure point," she said. "The kind that would bury your wagons." There was a long silence. "Show me the map," Wallace Whitfield said. Gerald Prout made a sound that might have been protest, but Wallace Whitfield was already pulling a chair away from the corner table, clearing space for Celia to lay her maps out, and whatever complex social machinery governed the Hartwell Wagon Company clearly ran on Wallace Whitfield's authority. Because Prout subsided and sat down and did not say another word for the next 40 minutes, while Celia walked the trail boss through her survey findings with a precision and clarity that she had learned to deploy like a weapon. She showed him the fault line readings. She showed him the shale striations in the eastern section of the pass that indicated ground movement. She showed him the microfracture patterns she had documented in the granite face above the trail. She showed him the alternate route she had partially surveyed the previous summer, longer by 11 miles, harder in 3 places, but geologically sound and stable. Wallace Whitfield listened to all of it. He asked sharp questions. She answered every one of them. He pointed to a section of her alternate route map where she had noted the survey as incomplete. She explained exactly why that section remained unmapped, and what she believed, based on the surrounding rock formations, they would find there. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Your qualifications," he said. She told him all of them. "Drummond's protégé," he said. "His successor, he called it," she said, "though I don't know that the title comes with any official standing." Another silence. Wallace Whitfield looked at the map. He looked at her. "The previous surveyors in the hospital in Reno," he said. "We depart in 4 days. The pay is $30 and a full supply share." 40, Celia said. He almost smiled. 35, and you eat with the crew." Agreed. She had expected that to be the end of the hard part. It was not. The Hartwell Wagon Company had 63 people in it, and the majority of them had very clear ideas about what a woman's role was on a frontier wagon journey. And none of those ideas included the woman riding at the front of the column with a compass and a geological survey notebook, while the men deferred to her route recommendations. The first 3 days out of Reno were a study in the specific kind of resistance that never quite materializes into outright confrontation, because it is made entirely of small dismissals. Men talking over her at the evening planning sessions. Settlers asking Wallace Whitfield to confirm her guidance as though she were not standing right there. The persistent low-grade assumption that she must have someone advising her from somewhere, some male authority whose recommendations she was merely relaying. Celia endured it. She had endured it before, and she would endure it again, and her method was always the same. She did her work with such meticulous excellence that the evidence eventually spoke louder than the dismissal. What she had not anticipated was how much time she would spend thinking about Wallace Whitfield. He was not easy to read. He treated her with a brisk professional courtesy that was, she recognized, genuinely more respect than most men in his position would have offered. He did not dismiss her recommendations. He did not talk over her in the planning sessions. He enforced, with quiet, immovable authority, the understanding that she was the geological expert on this journey, and her word on matters of terrain was final. When one of the older teamsters, a man named Burl Hawkins, had loudly proclaimed at the end of the first week that he did not see why they were taking orders from a woman when any man with eyes could see the trail well enough, Wallace Whitfield had looked at Burl Hawkins with an expression so utterly flat and calm that the older man had gone silent in the middle of his own sentence. "Miss Underwood is the reason I took this contract," Wallace said, and his voice was completely level. "Her assessment of the route is why you still have all your wagons intact, instead of one of them at the bottom of the ravine we bypassed 2 days ago. You ride in this company, you ride by her guidance, same as mine. We clear." Burl Hawkins had been clear. But between Wallace's professional courtesy and anything warmer lay a considerable distance, and Celia found herself noticing, with a mixture of irritation and fascination, the specific quality of that distance. It was not hostility. It was not indifference. It was something more like deliberate restraint, which was an interesting quality in a man who struck her otherwise as someone who did not hold back much. She learned pieces of his history in the way you learn things on a long trail journey, not through direct inquiry but through the slow accumulation of detail. He was 32 years old. He had been trail boss for 6 years, before that a cavalry scout for the army, before that she was not entirely sure, and he did not volunteer information about it. He had grown up in Texas. He read, she had seen him with books on 3 separate evenings, which surprised her and then made her realize she was doing exactly to him what she resented people doing to her, making assumptions from the surface and then being surprised by the depth. He took his coffee black and did not talk before he had it. He had a horse named Ambrose who was the most intelligent-looking animal Celia had ever encountered. A big bay gelding with dark, intelligent eyes, who seemed to actually understand the trail boss's quiet, murmured commands. On the evening of the 14th day, camped on the western slope below the point where they would begin the ascent toward Caspar Pass, Celia was sitting alone with her lantern and her field notebook, transferring the day's observations into clean written form. When Wallace Whitfield sat down on the opposite side of her fire without asking permission, which she noted with a flicker of something she chose not to examine too closely. "You were quiet today," he said. She looked up from her notebook. "I'm often quiet." "Not like that." He looked at the fire. "You found something that bothered you." It was not a question. She regarded him for a moment, recalibrating. She had not thought he paid that much attention. "The rock face on the eastern side of the pass," she said. "I want to go up tomorrow morning early and take samples before we start the ascent." "What did you see?" "A shale layer that shouldn't be there at that elevation. And the limestone above it is showing compression fracturing. It suggests the fault is under more stress than I originally estimated." Wallace Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "How much more stress?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need the samples." She paused. "I want you to know, Mr. Whitfield, that if I find what I think I'm going to find, I'm going to recommend we halt the ascent until I've had time to do a full assessment." He looked at her then, directly and without the usual professional glaze. "Even if it costs us 3 days. Even if it costs us a week." Another silence. The fire popped. Somewhere in the camp a baby was crying, its mother's voice rising in soothing response. "All right," he said. "Just like that." "You haven't been wrong once in 2 weeks," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite flat anymore, something with an edge to it that she could not immediately categorize. "I'm not going to start second-guessing you now." She looked at him for a long moment. "Most men would." "I'm not most men," she believed him. That was the problem. She was beginning to think. She was beginning to believe quite a lot of things about Wallace Whitfield that were making it harder to maintain the clean professional distance she had kept so carefully since the beginning. She had gone up before dawn the next morning. That morning, the morning the mountain died, and taken her samples, and confirmed her worst fears. And then the mountain had moved before she could get back down to tell anyone. And now she was on a narrow ledge 200 feet above the valley floor, with a wall of rock between her and 63 people who were going to need her to do the most important geological work of her life. Celia took stock. She was not hurt. She had a canteen with about 2 hours of water, a compass, her field notebook, her rock hammer, her sample bag, a folded copy of her survey map in the breast pocket of her canvas jacket, and a Remington Model 1858 revolver that she carried because the Sierra Nevada in 1872 was not a place you went unarmed. She had been carrying that pistol for 2 years and could put 5 shots in a 6-inch group at 30 yards, a fact that she had demonstrated on one memorable occasion to a man named Hector Dole, who had decided that her being alone in a survey camp meant she was available for imposition, and who had retreated from the proposition rather quickly after she put 3 holes in the tree directly behind his left ear. She looked at the rubble field that had been the pass. Then she looked north, along the ridge line, toward the section of terrain that she had surveyed the previous summer and that she knew contained the hidden route, a low, sheltered couloir through the granite that descended on the far side to the valley below, navigating not through the main pass but through a geological fault line that, unlike the one that had just destroyed the Caspar Pass, was old and stable and had been transmitting its load laterally for centuries without incident. It was longer. It was higher at one point by about 200 feet. 3 sections would require the wagons to be disassembled and reassembled by hand, but it was passable. She knew it was passable. She had walked every foot of it herself. The problem was that the settlers were on the other side of the rubble and she was on this side. She looked at the rubble wall again. It was 40 feet of loose granite debris, the surface still shifting slightly as pieces settled. It was not climbable from this side, not safely, not today while it was still actively moving. But there was another way. She turned back south along the ledge, moving quickly, her boots finding the narrow rock surface with practiced ease. She had noticed, 2 days ago on her first pass through this section, a place where a natural fissure in the cliff face created something almost like a rough staircase dropping down to the valley floor. It was not safe by any urban standard of safety. By frontier standards it was manageable. She found the fissure. She went down. The descent took 23 minutes. Twice the loose rock crumbled under her boot, and she had to catch herself, once by driving her rock hammer into the crack and hanging from it for a stomach-lurching moment while her feet scrambled for purchase. She did not fall. She reached the valley floor with a scraped right palm and a rapidly darkening bruise on her left hip, where she had clipped a granite protrusion, and she stood in the dust at the base of the cliff and caught her breath, and then began to run. She knew the terrain of the valley well enough. The rubble from the landslide had blocked the pass entrance from the far side as well, the cone of debris spreading 100 yards out into the valley floor below the east entrance to the pass. She circled the rubble field at a distance, approaching from the south where the terrain was clear, and came around the edge of the debris field to find exactly the scene she had expected and dreaded. 11 wagons, 63 people, and the quiet, controlled chaos of a community confronting an impossible wall. Several men were already at the base of the rubble, examining it with the particular expression of men who have decided that a physical problem must yield to physical effort regardless of what physics has to say about it. She could hear voices raised in disagreement. She could see women gathered in clusters near the wagons, some of them holding children, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from frightened to stony. She could see Gerald Prout, who had ridden out with the company from Reno in his capacity as company representative, standing at the edge of the rubble field with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated that she suspected was grief dressed up as anger. She did not see Wallace Whitfield. Miss Underwood, she spun. He was 30 feet away, coming from the direction of the southernmost wagon at a pace that was controlled but fast, and the look on his face when he saw her stopped her moving for a full second. It was not relief, exactly. It was something rawer than relief, something that did not have a clean name. His jaw was set and his eyes were very dark, and he looked at her the way you look at something you were certain you had lost. "I saw the landslide from camp," he said, and his voice was carefully level in the way that Celia was beginning to understand meant he was feeling something very large that he had decided not to let move on his face. "You were up on that ledge." I'm fine." "You're bleeding." She looked down at her right hand. The scraped palm had left a thin trail of blood along her fingers. "I descended a cliff fissure. I'm fine." He looked at her for another moment, then he looked at the rubble wall. Then he looked back at her and his voice dropped to something that was just between the two of them. "Tell me you have a plan." "I have a plan," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Of course you do. I need the full company together. I need your attention and everyone else's." She looked past him to the gathering crowd. "I know where there's a way through." He did not ask her how. He did not ask her if she was sure. He turned and put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle so sharp and loud that it cut through every conversation in the camp simultaneously. And within 4 minutes every adult in the Hartwell Wagon Company was standing in a rough semicircle facing the rubble wall and listening to Celia Underwood explain the hidden route. She laid her map on the hood of the nearest wagon, held flat against the wood with 4 stones, and talked them through it. She was clear and specific and direct, and she did not soften the hard parts. The 3 sections where the wagons would need to be broken down, the high traverse at 2,000 feet with its narrow margins, the creek crossing that would require cutting new poles for the heavier wagon beds. She explained the geology in plain language, why this route was stable when the main pass had not been, what the ancient fault structure meant in terms of load-bearing capacity and long-term safety. She answered every question. When Burl Hawkins asked, with a tone that suggested he had not entirely revised his earlier opinions, whether she was absolutely certain this route was passable for wagons, she looked at him calmly and said that she had walked it herself from one end to the other, had measured the critical clearances, had assessed the surface composition of every significant section, and was staking her professional reputation on it. "You're also staking 63 lives on it," Gerald Prout said, and he did not say it unkindly. His voice had the flat quality of a frightened man trying to be practical. "Yes," Celia said. I am. Another silence. She could feel the weight of all of them looking at her, 63 sets of eyes carrying 63 different weights of hope and fear and doubt, and she met that weight the way she always did, by standing perfectly still and letting her certainty speak for her. "We depart in 2 hours," Wallace Whitfield said, and the discussion was over. In those 2 hours, Celia did not rest. She moved through the preparations with focused intensity, confirming the order of the wagon column, identifying the 3 strongest teams for the first difficult section, reviewing her notes on the creek crossing, and sketching a hasty diagram for the men who would be cutting the poles. Wallace moved alongside the preparations with the same efficient authority she had come to recognize as his native mode of operation, and there was a new quality to how the company related to both of them. A kind of unified attention that had not been there before, forged by the shared shock of the landslide into something that felt, for the first time, like genuine cohesion. She noticed, somewhere in the middle of the second hour, that Wallace had stationed himself so that he was never more than 20 feet from her. She was not certain he was doing it consciously. She told herself she was not going to mention it. She also told herself she was not going to think about the look on his face when he had seen her come around the edge of the rubble field. She told herself that, without much confidence in her own conviction, the route was as she remembered it. The first section was the hardest, a steep switchback ascent that required the wagons to be taken up individually. The teams doubled, every able-bodied person either pulling on ropes or walking beside to prevent sideways drift. It took 3 hours for 11 wagons. By the end of it, everyone was exhausted and dust-covered, and the early afternoon sun was pressing down on the ridge with an intensity that made the air shimmer. At the rest halt, Celia was on her knees behind the third wagon, checking the axle for stress cracks from the ascent, when she heard a sound behind her and looked up to find Wallace crouching next to her with a canteen. "Drink," he said. "You haven't stopped since this morning. I'll stop when we're through the high traverse. You'll stop now for 5 minutes and drink some water, or I'll carry you to a shaded spot myself and stand over you while you do it." He said this with complete calm, and somehow the calmness made it less like a command and more like an expression of concern that had no other language available to it. She drank. He sat down against the wagon wheel beside her, and they were quiet together for a moment in the way that 2 people can be quiet together when they have been through something significant and the words have not caught up yet. "The axle?" he asked, nodding at the wagon. "Fine. Minor stress scoring on the left rear, but nothing that will fail. I'd want to check it again after the high traverse." She paused. "You should know that the hardest section is still ahead, the narrow traverse." "How narrow?" "The wagons will clear with about 2 feet on the right side and 4 on the left. The right side is a wall, the left side is open air." He was quiet for a moment. "How far down?" "About 600 feet. He absorbed this. "We'll need guide ropes on the left side, full brake on the wheels." "I was thinking the same thing. And the horses need blindfolds for that section. The drop will unsettle them and I don't want them shying left." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, not the professional appraisal of the first meeting, not the flat authority of the trail boss in action, but something more direct and more unguarded. "You thought of that," he said. "The horses. I rode through it on my last survey. One of my pack horses skittered badly at the edge. I didn't have blindfolds then." "What did you do?" "I talked to him," she said. "For about 20 minutes. Stayed between him and the edge and talked until he calmed down enough to move." Wallace was quiet for a moment. "Alone," he said. "I'm usually alone." He looked away from her, out across the ridge toward the valley below. The afternoon light was doing something golden and particular to the peaks above them, and the silence between them had changed quality again, shifted into something she was having an increasingly difficult time not naming. "Is that what you prefer?" he asked, and the question was quieter than his usual register. She considered being oblique. She decided against it. "I've never been offered a better alternative," she said. He looked back at her then, and whatever restraint he had been maintaining since the beginning of this journey, that careful professional distance that she had noted and puzzled over and tried not to care about, was not entirely in place at this particular moment. She could see it. She could see what was under it. It made her chest do something inconvenient. Then he stood and held his hand down to pull her to her feet, and she took it. And for a moment they were both standing and not quite stepping away from the proximity. And then Burl Hawkins bellowed from the front of the column that the rest halt was over, and the moment broke apart like the wave it had been, and they both turned back to the work. The high traverse was, as Celia had warned, terrifying. Not for her, she had done it before, and familiarity with a danger changes its emotional weight even when it does not change the physical reality. But watching 11 wagons move through that 200-yard stretch of 4-foot-wide rock ledge above a 600-foot drop, with guide ropes and blinkered horses, and a team of sweating, white-faced men steadying the wheel spokes by hand, it was the longest hour of her professional life. She walked the traverse 6 times, once at the front to confirm the route as clear, once beside each of the 4 heaviest wagons, watching the right wheel clearance, listening for the sound of stone edge beginning to crumble under load, once at the back to check that the last wagon's rear axle was tracking correctly. She called out corrections in a clear, steady voice, and she did not look down, not because she was afraid of the drop, but because there was no useful information down there, and she needed all her attention on the 2 feet of stone under the right wheels. When the last wagon cleared the far end of the traverse and the whole company was safely on the broad sloping terrain below, there was a sound that rose from 63 people simultaneously that was not quite cheering and not quite crying, but was some profound mixture of both. Children were lifted. People embraced. Burl Hawkins, to Celia's private amazement, sat down on a rock and put his face in his hands. She stood at the edge of the traverse's far end and watched her route deliver its people safely, and she felt the deep particular satisfaction of work done exactly right, the kind that had kept her in this profession, through every dismissal and every closed door and every gentleman who had looked at C.E. Underwood's papers and then looked at Celia Underwood's face and refused to reconcile the two. Wallace came to stand beside her. He was not pretending about his expression this time. He looked at her with something so clear and direct that she felt it like a hand on her chest. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "The first 2 weeks. The way I kept—" He stopped. "Started again. I treated you professionally. I didn't dismiss your work, but there was something I held back." He seemed to be having difficulty with the words in a way she found unexpectedly endearing on a man who was otherwise so deliberately composed. "I kept waiting for you to be wrong. About the geology, about the route, about any of it. Not because I had any specific reason to think you would be. Just because I had made assumptions about what women could do out here." He looked back at the traverse. "And I've been watching you for 6 weeks do things that I could not have done, that most people I know could not have done. Today, those people are alive because of what you know and what you did, and I need you to hear me say that clearly." Celia was quiet for a moment. "You're a man who apologizes," she said, "when I'm wrong. That's rarer than you might think." "I know." She looked at him, this rugged and composed and unexpectedly complicated man who had just said the most important thing anyone had said to her in 3 years of frontier work, and she made a choice that was frightening and right in the same proportion. "You asked me this morning if I preferred being alone," she said. He looked at her very carefully. "I meant what I said. I haven't been offered a better alternative." She paused. "I'm not sure that's still true." The silence between them was charged with something she had been feeling for weeks and had been naming everything except what it actually was. Wallace Whitfield was looking at her as though she were the most remarkable thing this frontier had ever produced, and not in the way that people looked at remarkable things as objects of curiosity, but in the way that people look at remarkable things when they realize those things have the power to change them. "Celia," he said, and her name in his voice, not Miss Underwood, just Celia, was like the first real warmth after a long cold. "Not yet," she said. "Get everyone through the second switchback. There's another difficult section in 3 hours." She picked up her compass and her notebook. "Then we can talk." Something shifted in his face that was very close to a smile. "I've been doing a lot of things in the wrong order this trip," he said. "You've also been doing quite a lot of things right," she said, and walked toward the head of the column before either of them could say anything they were not yet ready for. The second switchback was easier than the first. The creek crossing was challenging. The water was higher than Celia had measured it in July, the late summer snowmelt in the peaks above still running strong, and the ford she had designated was running at about chest height on the horses, which required a full assessment and a revision to a crossing point 40 yards upstream, where the bed was rockier and shallower. She found the better crossing in under 10 minutes, while a circle of men who had been standing with their arms crossed waiting for someone to make a decision, watched her wade upstream in her boots, reading the water with the same quiet, methodical focus she brought to reading rock. Burl Hawkins, of all people, was the one who waded in first after her to help test the crossing. They exchanged a look as they stood in the cold, knee-deep water that acknowledged something between them without requiring either of them to say it out loud. By late afternoon, the company had descended the far slope of the alternate route and was on the broad valley floor on the California side of the Sierra Nevada, with the setting sun ahead of them and the mountains behind them, and 63 people in 11 wagons, and no casualties more significant than 2 scraped knuckles and a sprained ankle from the second switchback. They camped early that night, by common consent, with a fire large enough to warm the whole company and a mood that moved between grateful exhaustion and the particular warmth that people feel toward each other when they have collectively survived something that could have killed them. Celia sat at the edge of the firelight with her field notebook, writing her observations from the day in the meticulous detail that was her professional standard, the geological characteristics of the alternate route, the structural measurements at the high traverse, the notes on the fault formation that had made the Caspar Pass failure inevitable. She wrote a full account of the landslide event itself, the time, the preliminary sound, the approximate volume of material displaced, the estimated failure mechanism. She wrote it all because that was what you did with data. You preserved it. You contributed it to the record. You made sure that the next person who came this way would have access to what you had learned. She was deep in this work when she heard footsteps and looked up to find Wallace standing over her, holding 2 tin mugs. "Coffee," he said. "Thank you." He sat down. Not across from her this time, but beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling night air. They drank their coffee. The fire crackled. Around them the camp settled into its nighttime rhythms, children put to bed, men checking the horses, the low murmur of exhausted conversation slowly fading. "I want to tell you something," Wallace said, and his voice was quiet and had none of the professional layer to it, just the man himself. "About why I kept that distance." She waited. "Before I took this contract, I was engaged to be married," he said. "Woman named Ellen Farrow, schoolteacher in Reno. I had spent 2 years thinking I was building something with her, and 4 months ago she told me she had married someone else. A banker. Someone who wasn't going to disappear for months at a time into the wilderness." I was looking at the fire. "She wasn't wrong about what I was, about the kind of life I live. But you're still living it," Celia said. "Yes. So it didn't change you. It made me careful," he said, "about what I let myself feel for someone, about whether it's fair to feel anything at all for someone when this is what I do." He turned to look at her. "And then I met you, and you were doing the same thing I was doing, living a life that most people think is incompatible with anything else. And I didn't know what to do with that." Celia was quiet for a moment. "You thought that made it safer," she said, "to feel something. Or more complicated," he said. "It is more complicated," she said. "I'm not going to stop doing this work, not for anyone." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said, and he said it with a directness and a steadiness that she absolutely believed. "I have no interest in a version of you that isn't doing exactly what you do best in the world." She looked at him for a long moment, this man with his dark eyes and his scarred hands and the unexpected depth of him that she had been discovering in small increments for 6 weeks. "I'm not easy," she said. "I've been told that many times." "I've noticed," he said, and there was warmth in it. "I won't be talked over. I won't be managed. I won't pretend I know less than I do to make someone more comfortable." "Good," he said. "I have a temper when my professional judgment is dismissed. I've seen it. It's entirely warranted." She felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, not someone who listens." He looked at her, and the firelight was doing something very specific to his face, illuminating the quality in his expression that she had been trying not to name. He reached out and with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him took her right hand, the one with the scraped palm, and held it carefully. "This morning," he said, "when I saw you come around the edge of that rubble field, before you said anything, before I knew you had a plan," he stopped. "I need you to know what that was like." "Tell me," she said quietly. "The worst 4 hours of my life were from when I saw that landslide to when I saw your face," he said. "And I'd like to not have more of those hours if I can help it. I'm hard to keep safe," she said. "My work takes me into dangerous places. I know, I'll learn to live with that. What I can't learn to live with is being on the wrong side of whatever this is." His thumb moved across her knuckles very gently. "Can you tell me what this is, Celia?" She looked at their hands together. She looked at his face. She thought about 6 weeks of professional respect gradually becoming something that had no professional name for it. About a man who had enforced her authority in front of 63 strangers because it was right. About a man who had asked for her plan and then acted on it without question. About a man who had just told her the most honest thing she had heard from anyone in a very long time. "I think it's something we should find out," she said. He kissed her then in the firelight, with the company settling to sleep around them, and the Sierra Nevada standing dark behind them and California spread out ahead. And it was the kind of kiss that felt like a question being answered careful at first, and then not careful at all, warm and certain and absolutely right. When they broke apart, Celia was aware of her heart beating at a rate that she would have attributed under other circumstances to exertion. "That was," she started. "Yes," he said with complete conviction. She laughed, which surprised her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed like that, spontaneous and unguarded and full. He looked at the laugh on her face with an expression that she thought she could look at for a very long time without growing tired of it. The next 3 weeks were the most complicated and most rewarding of Celia's life. They completed the journey to Sacramento, arriving 12 days behind the original schedule, but with every wagon, every person, and every pound of supplies intact. The story of the landslide and the alternate route spread quickly through the settler community, with the speed that frontier news always travels when it involves survival against the impossible. And by the time the Hartwell Company rolled into Sacramento, there were people waiting to hear the account firsthand. Celia gave her professional account to a reporter from the Sacramento Union, clearly and factually, and the resulting article, "Woman Geologist Saves Company of 63 Through Buried Pass," appeared 4 days later and caused a considerable sensation, which was not something Celia had sought and not something she was entirely comfortable with, but which she recognized might be useful for the women who came after her in this work. She also drafted a formal report to the United States Geological Survey, complete with all her field measurements, documenting both the Caspar Pass failure and the alternate route, with her recommendation that the alternate route be formally surveyed and designated as the primary crossing. She mailed this to the Washington office with considerably less confidence that it would be read than she would have liked, but she sent it anyway because that was her job. Wallace settled the Hartwell Company's contract in Sacramento, paid out the crew, and dealt with Gerald Prout's somewhat fraught debrief with the company's board. The board, to their credit, did not dispute that the alternate route had been necessary and correct. Their main concern was the schedule loss, which Wallace addressed with a flat practicality that apparently satisfied them, because the meeting ended with a renewed contract for the following spring. On the third evening after arrival in Sacramento, they had dinner together at a restaurant on the main street, their first real dinner not eaten in trail conditions, and it was simultaneously more awkward and more intimate than anything they had managed in weeks of proximity on the trail. Because on the trail, there had always been work to structure the time, and here they were simply two people sitting across a table from each other without any professional framework to navigate by. "You're nervous," Wallace said, and he seemed to find this more endearing than anything. "I'm not nervous," Celia said. "I'm recalibrating." "To what?" "To this." She gestured between them in a way that was not entirely elegant. "To talking to you when there isn't an immediate geological emergency." He smiled. It was the real version of the smile she had caught half-glimpses of on the trail, complete and unguarded, and it made him look younger and less weathered and entirely too attractive for her peace of mind. "I talk to people all the time without geological emergencies," he said. "I'm aware that you do. I'm the one who doesn't." She looked at her coffee cup. "My social experience has been primarily professional for the past 3 years. I am better at reading fault lines than at reading rooms." "You're doing fine," he said. "I'm doing inadequately and choosing to commit to it." He laughed outright at that, a real laugh that turned heads at 2 neighboring tables, and Celia felt the warmth of it move through her in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the stimulus and that she was going to need to get better at managing if this was going to work. "Tell me something," he said. "Something that isn't about geology." She thought about it seriously. "I grew up in Pennsylvania," she said. "My father was a mining engineer. He used to take me down into the shafts when I was small. I think I've spent my whole life chasing the thing I felt down there, the sense of the earth having a history that predates everything human and is largely indifferent to us. It's not frightening exactly, it's clarifying." She paused. "That's still about geology." "No," he said, "it's about you." She looked at him. "It's about why you are the way you are," he said. "That's not geology, that's everything." She thought she might be in considerably more trouble with this man than she had previously estimated. They spent 2 weeks in Sacramento, which was 2 weeks of evenings like that dinner talking, arguing sometimes, about everything from survey methodology to the conduct of the Army in the territories, about which Wallace had views that surprised her, and on reflection, probably should not have given his background as a scout. He had seen things during his cavalry years that had left their marks on him, and he talked about them with a directness that she respected, and a weariness that told her the marks had not healed clean. "The Paiute in the northern Nevada territory," she said one evening, when the conversation had moved there. "I've done survey work near their land. The way the government draws the boundary lines with no reference to where people have actually been living." "I know," he said, and his voice was short and flat in a way that told her he knew it from inside, not from observation. She did not push. She understood the particular silence of a man carrying something he was not yet ready to lay down completely, and she honored it the way she would want her own necessary silences honored. But 3 nights later, he told her the rest of it: the patrol in 1869 that he had ridden as a scout, the village, the orders he had been given that he had refused, the subsequent discharge that had been mutual and bitter, the 3 years of trail work that had been partly rehabilitation and partly penance for being part of a system that had done what it had done. She listened to all of it without comment or absolution, because he was not asking for either, only for someone to know. When he finished, he looked at her with the particular watchfulness of someone waiting for judgment. "You chose correctly," she said, "when the moment required it." "It required it before that moment," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you got there." He was quiet for a while. "Then, most people I've told that to have found some way to make it more comfortable than it was." "I don't think you want it made comfortable," she said. "I think you want it witnessed." He looked at her with an expression that she could not quite describe except that it made her throat tighten. "How did you get so clear?" he said. "Not a question exactly." "Fault lines," she said. "They teach you that things look stable until they're not, and that the best thing you can do is read the evidence carefully and tell the truth about what you see." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that for a long time while Sacramento moved around them, and the particular quiet of two people who have told each other the most important things settled between them like bedrock. At the end of the second week, over breakfast with the morning light coming through the window at the boarding house where they had both taken rooms, Wallace said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that your answer will not change how I feel about you. It won't make me leave or make me push or make me do anything you don't want." "That's a significant preamble," she said. "I'm a thorough man." He looked at his coffee. "I have a piece of land in the Sierra Nevada foothills, about 40 miles east of Sacramento. I've been buying it in parcels over the last 3 years. It's not much yet. There's a house that needs work and about 200 acres of mixed terrain. But it's mine and it's in the mountains and the geological formations around it are—" He paused. "I looked at them when I was buying the land. I thought, if I knew what I was looking at, I'd know whether the land was worth what I was paying." She looked at him very carefully. "I'd like to show you the land," he said, "and I'd like to know what you see there, professionally." He met her eyes. "And I'd like you to consider whether it's a place you could base your survey work from, whether it has anything to recommend it in that respect." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking me to consider it as a base of operations." "I'm asking you to look at it," he said, "on your own terms, and tell me what you find." She thought about what it would mean to have a place in the mountains from which to work. A real base, not a borrowed survey camp or a boarding house room. She thought about what it would mean to have that place shared with someone who understood why the mountains mattered. She thought about Wallace Whitfield riding out to read geological formations on land he was considering buying, storing that observation away, waiting to tell her about it at exactly the right moment. "You planned that," she said. "I thought it might be relevant," he said, with no particular expression. "You have been thinking about this for some time." "Since about the end of the second week on the trail," he said. "When you redirected us around that ravine at 3 in the morning, with nothing but a lantern and a compass, and told me exactly why it was necessary." She looked at this man, this utterly, unexpectedly remarkable man, and felt something that was not so much falling as arriving at something she had not known she had been traveling toward, that had been waiting for her at the end of a route she had not been able to see from the beginning. "Show me the land," she said. The land was 42 miles east of Sacramento, up a road that climbed steadily into the Sierra foothills, through stands of ponderosa pine and open granite meadows. And when they arrived at it on a clear September morning, it looked exactly like what it was: rough frontier property in the early stages of being reclaimed from wildness. With a 2-room house that needed a new roof and a south wall repaired, and a corral in better shape than the house, and 200 acres of mixed oak and pine running up into a granite ridge above. And the geological formations were extraordinary. Celia got off her horse and spent the next 3 hours walking the land with her compass and her notebook, while Wallace watched her with a patience that she would later think was one of the most telling things he had ever done, because it was not the patience of a man waiting for a woman to finish something he considered peripheral. It was the patience of a man watching someone he loves do the thing they love most, which is a different thing entirely. The ridge above the property sat on a formation of igneous granite that was among the most stable she had seen in the Sierra Nevada, ancient, thoroughly stressed and settled, the kind of rock that did not move unless the mountains themselves moved. The creek running through the lower section of the property crossed 3 distinct geological boundaries visible in the exposed rock of the creek bed, which was the kind of naturally occurring cross-section that geologists spent years looking for, because it let you read the area's entire structural history in a single location. The surrounding terrain offered access to at least 4 distinct survey zones that she had wanted to work in for over a year. She stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the ridge, and she felt the particular sensation that she associated with geological truth, the sense of a place whose nature was entirely clear, entirely readable, offering nothing hidden that would break you without warning. "Well," Wallace said behind her. She turned. He was standing about 10 feet away, hat in his hands, looking at her with that quiet, watchful quality that she had come to understand was not restraint anymore, but simply the way he waited when he wanted something very much. "The rock here is the most stable I've seen in this range," she said. "The creek cross-section is exceptional. The survey access from this property alone would keep me occupied for 2 years at minimum." She paused. "And the house needs the south wall rebuilt with stone, not timber, because the drainage from the ridge will keep that wall wet and the timber will fail again." "I'll rebuild it in stone," he said. "You would need to extend the roof line on the east side as well. There's a winter wind corridor through the saddle above that will—" "Celia," he said. She stopped. "Do you like it?" he said. She looked around her at the ridge, the creek, the pines, the flawed and promising house in the middle of it, the man standing with his hat in his hands and 4 years of hope and careful restraint written in his face. "Yes," she said. "I like it very much." He crossed the distance between them and kissed her, out in the September sunlight with the creek running and the Sierra Nevada holding them in its ancient, indifferent, magnificent arms, and this time it was nothing cautious about it. It was the kiss of 2 people who have stopped negotiating with themselves and are simply, finally, present in the best moment of their lives. They were married in Sacramento in November of 1872 in a civil ceremony with 12 witnesses, most of them members of the Hartwell Company who had made the journey or were still in the area. Burl Hawkins was there and shook Celia's hand with a grip that conveyed the entire apology he was never going to say in words, which she accepted with equal wordlessness. Gerald Pruitt attended and had the grace to look genuinely happy about it. Celia wore a suit of good blue wool that she had ordered made by a dressmaker on Sacramento's Main Street, because she had no patience for impractical wedding clothes, but she was willing to acknowledge that this occasion warranted something better than canvas. Wallace wore his best coat, which was navy blue and fitted, and looked so different from trail attire that several people did a double take. They returned to the property in the foothills that same evening, arriving after dark with the lanterns lit, and the house warm from the fire they had asked a neighbor to tend. And the south wall was already beginning its repairs, and Celia stood in the main room of a house that was hers and looked at her husband in the lamplight, and thought that she had not known, 3 months ago, that this was the country that was waiting for her on the other side of the mountain. The following spring was the most productive of Celia's professional career. She worked from the property base as she had planned, making survey expeditions that lasted between 2 days and 2 weeks depending on the objective, returning each time to the foothills house and Wallace's steady, warm, entirely genuine welcome. She finished the survey of the alternate route she had navigated in September and submitted it to the U.S. Geological Survey with a full report documenting the Caspar Pass failure and its causes, its precursor signs, and the geological profile of the alternative route that she formally proposed as the primary crossing. This time the report was not lost in a filing cabinet. The 1872 article in the Sacramento Union had done something to her professional standing, not entirely unlike what a landslide does to a hillside, removing a great deal of accumulated obstruction very suddenly. The Geological Survey wrote back within a month. Her alternate route was formally surveyed and designated that summer. The territory named it the Underwood Crossing, which was the kind of honor that she received with complex feelings, because she was glad the route existed in the record and slightly impatient with the notion of having things named after her, as though the geology cared whose name was attached to it. Wallace signed on for 2 more Hartwell Company Trail boss contracts that year, both in better documented territory, both shorter journeys, and the time apart was hard in the specific way that Celia had known it would be and had decided was manageable because it was honest. They were both people with work that mattered to them, and they had agreed from the beginning that this was not a thing to negotiate away, but to honor. The letters they exchanged during these separations were the second best evidence of who they were together, the first being everything else. In the summer of 1873, Celia mapped the eastern section of the property's ridge and confirmed the presence of a significant silver-bearing quartz vein running through the upper granite. She documented it carefully, had it independently assayed by a mining engineer in Sacramento whose professional opinion she respected, confirmed the finding, and then had a deeply interesting conversation with Wallace about what it meant for the property and whether they wanted to develop it. "It's your discovery," he said, "your call. It's our land," she said. They discussed it for several evenings and arrived at a measured decision. A small, carefully managed surface extraction that would not compromise the geological stability of the ridge, done with a contractor known for respecting site integrity, with Celia directing the technical aspects. The resulting income was modest but real, and it went into the south wall repair, and the new roof and a second room added to the east side of the house, and eventually into a surgery fund for the property that Celia thought about with the particular practical foresight of someone who had spent enough time in remote terrain to know that things went wrong, and you needed resources when they did. They had their first serious argument in September of 1873 about a survey contract in the Wyoming Territory that would have taken Celia away for 3 months, during which time she had discovered, about 6 weeks before the departure date, that she was pregnant. She told him directly, because she had no other method. He sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for approximately 45 seconds, which was a long time for a man she had come to understand process things quickly. And then he looked up at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had the quality of enormity. "The Wyoming contract," he said. "I'm not going," she said. "That's not the argument." "What's the argument?" "The argument is that you're going to try to keep me close to the house for the next 7 months, and I'm not going to do that." He looked at her. "Celia, I am a healthy 29-year-old woman in excellent physical condition," she said. "I have been climbing Sierra Nevada ridges for 3 years. Pregnancy does not render me incapable of survey work. In the third trimester, I will conduct my surveys on terrain within 20 miles of this house, and I will not climb above 8,000 feet. I have already worked this out." She met his eyes. "I need you to trust me on this, the way you trusted me on the alternate route." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face settled into the characteristic steadiness that was, she thought, the most fundamentally reliable thing about him. "You've already surveyed the local terrain," he said. "I've been surveying it since we moved here. And you know what within 20 miles of this house offers. Enough to keep me occupied for the next 4 months," she said. "And enough interesting questions to answer to come back to after." He reached across the table and took her hand. "All right," he said. "Just like that. You haven't been wrong about terrain assessment yet," he said, and the echo of what he had said on the rest halt before the traverse was entirely deliberate, and she felt it land precisely where it was aimed. Their son was born in April of 1874, delivered by a competent midwife named Clara Hartley, who had come to the foothills from Sacramento 3 weeks before the expected date at Celia's entirely practical request, because she had identified a scenario of complication and wanted medical expertise on hand in case of it. The complication did not materialize. The birth was hard and long and entirely undramatic afterward, and the boy came into the world making a sound that suggested he was already forming opinions. They named him James Drummond Whitfield, the middle name for Professor Elias Drummond, who received the notification of this honor from Celia's letter, with what she imagined was considerable surprise, and what he wrote back was considerable moved gratitude. Wallace held James for the first time with the careful, slightly disbelieving quality of a man who has been entirely competent with every physical challenge this frontier has offered him, and is now confronted with something so small and so enormous simultaneously that his competence feels inadequate to it. Celia watched this and felt a tenderness so acute it was almost painful. "He looks like you," Wallace said. "He has your mouth," Celia said. "That's ominous," Wallace said, and she laughed. James was a child of the Sierra Nevada from his first summer. Celia carried him on the shorter local surveys in a carrier worn across her chest, and the boy seemed to have inherited her interest in the physical world, or perhaps it was simply that being carried through geological formations was what constituted normal life for him, and he took his orientation from the stone and sky the way children take their orientation from whatever is constant in their early world. She received, in the summer of 1874, a formal letter from the United States Geological Survey offering her a position as a regional survey consultant for the California and Nevada territories, which was an unprecedented acknowledgement on the part of a federal institution that women existed and were capable of this work. She discussed it with Wallace over several evenings, talked through the practical implications, the contracts, the compensation, the way it would interact with her existing independent work. "Take it," he said. "It will complicate its recognition you've earned 3 times over," he said. "Take it." She took it. The letter of acceptance that she wrote to the USGS was, she thought, among the more satisfying pieces of correspondence she had composed in a life that contained several satisfying documents. Wallace took on fewer long-trail contracts after James was born, not because Celia had asked him to, but because he had, on his own assessment, decided that the trail boss work served him differently now than it had before, and that the land in the foothills offered him something he had not understood he was looking for until he had it. He had been rebuilding the property steadily for 2 years, and by the spring of 1875 it was a genuinely beautiful place. The house solid and extended and warm, the corral enlarged to accommodate 4 horses, a small barn, a vegetable garden that Wallace managed with the same quiet, methodical attention he brought to everything, a creek-fed irrigation channel that he had designed and dug himself over 3 weekends. He still took occasional contracts, a mountain survey escort here, a route assessment there, because he was good at it, and because staying in one place all the time did not suit either of them, and they had agreed early that the thing that made their life together work was precisely that neither of them required the other to be less than what they were. In 1875 they had their second child, a girl they named Elara Frances Whitfield, who arrived in June with considerably less ceremony than James had, and who, by the time she was 8 months old, had her father entirely under her spell in a way that Celia observed with affectionate amusement and absolutely no jealousy, because she could see that Elara had Wallace's eyes and his calm. And it was a remarkable thing to watch someone who had been forged by hard country and harder experience discover that the most devastating power in the world was deployed by a small girl with dark eyes, who had decided that he was the most interesting thing in it. The years that followed had the quality of something built, not static, not finished, but accumulating steadily toward a shape that could bear weight. Celia's consulting work with the USGS expanded. She published 6 more papers between 1874 and 1878 under her own full name, no longer CE but Celia Underwood Whitfield, which she chose specifically because she wanted both identities in the record. 2 of those papers were cited in the USGS's 1877 survey of the Central Sierra Nevada, which the foreword noted had been shaped significantly by her prior fieldwork. The Underwood crossing remained in use and was formalized in 1876 as the designated alternate route for Sierra Nevada crossings, when the Caspar Pass area was declared permanently impassable following Celia's documentation of continued fault instability. Governor Aldous Crane, who had laughed at her 3 years earlier, did not personally apologize. She did not expect him to. She found that she had moved past the need for that particular recognition in a way that felt less like resignation and more like freedom, the freedom of someone whose work speaks clearly enough that the opinion of any individual audience member has ceased to be the measure of it. In the spring of 1878, Wallace took her back to the Caspar Pass area for the first time since that September morning 6 years earlier. They rode up into the mountains together, while the children stayed with Clara Hartley and her family in Sacramento, and they stood at the edge of the still massive rubble field where the mountain had moved and looked at the landscape that had changed so violently and had stayed changed. The rubble was not rubble anymore, exactly. 6 years of weather and soil accumulation and the patient work of mountain plants had begun to soften the edges of the destruction. Scrub pine was growing out of cracks in the deposited stone. A creek had found a new course through the lowest section of the debris field, nature doing what nature does, reading the new configuration and adapting to it without mourning the old one. "Do you remember what you said to me," Wallace said, "when I asked you to tell me what this was?" She looked at him. "I said I thought it was something we should find out." "Yes." He was looking at her with that expression she knew, the one that still had the power to make her breath catch slightly when she was not paying attention to herself. "I think we've found out. I think we've found out several things," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together at the edge of the buried pass and looked at the way the land had changed and was still changing, the slow, undeniable movement of the earth toward whatever it was going to be next, patient and indifferent and utterly magnificent. "I want to show you something," she said. She led him along the ridge, north, the way she had walked that September morning 6 years ago with a scraped palm and a plan. She walked him to the entrance of the alternate route, the hidden couloir through the granite that she had found on a solo survey, and saved a company of 63 people with, the passage that now bore her name on government maps, and that she had walked through more times than she could count in the intervening years. They went through it together on foot, Ambrose and her horse tied below. She narrated as they walked the geological features she had identified on that first survey, the fault structure that made it stable, the specific formations that had told her with certainty that this route would hold. He listened with the quality of attention he had always given her work, complete and serious and genuinely interested. At the high point of the route, where the broad granite shelf opened up to a view that took in 60 miles of Sierra Nevada ridge and valley, they stopped. The view was the same view she had seen alone on her first survey through here, the sweep of stone and pine and sky, the ancient world going about its business below the human story, the mountains entirely unconcerned with any of the things that had happened to and through and because of them. "I was right up here when the main pass failed," she said. "Over there on that ledge. I watched it happen." He looked at the ledge, then he looked at her. "And then you got yourself down and found the way back to us." "That is a tidy summary," she said. "It's a love story," he said. She looked at him. "It's a geological survey," she said. "Those things are not mutually exclusive," he said. And she laughed, and the laugh rang out across the granite shelf and down into the valley below and into the ancient patient air of the Sierra Nevada, which had been here before them and would be here after them, and held them in the meantime in its magnificent, indifferent, perfectly geological embrace. They rode back to the foothills property that evening. The children were due home the following morning. James, at 4 years old, already asking questions about rocks that Celia answered with the serious thoroughness that Wallace found endlessly endearing. Alara, at 2, already demonstrating a preference for climbing that was going to require careful management. The house was warm when they arrived. Wallace put the horses up and Celia built the fire and made coffee, and they sat together in the main room with the lamplight and the evening quiet. And Celia had her field notebook open because she always had her field notebook open, and she was writing the observations from the day on the ridge, the new plant colonization of the debris field, the creek's new course, the estimated timeline of geological recovery. "You're documenting the recovery," Wallace said. "Someone should. You never stop working." "Neither do you," he smiled. Fair, he watched her write for a moment. "What does it say, the geology, about what happens next?" She looked up from the notebook. "The debris field will continue to stabilize. The new creek course is establishing itself in a rock channel and will persist. In about 200 years, you won't be able to tell there was a pass there at all." She paused. "The alternate route will remain passable for as long as that section of the range exists. The underlying formation is—" She stopped. "You're not asking about the debris field." "No," he said. She closed the notebook. She looked at this man, this infuriating, patient, deep, steady, endlessly surprising man who had sat down at her fire 6 years ago, and asked her what was wrong, and who had not stopped paying attention since. "The geology says we're on stable ground," she said. He reached across and took her hand, the right one, the one that still had a faint scar on the palm from the cliff descent on the day the mountain fell. "Good," he said. She looked at the scar under his thumb. "You know, when I came down that cliff and walked around that rubble field, the reason I was not afraid was that I knew I had a root." "I know," he said. "I know it now about this too," she said. "About us. About this." She looked at him with the same clear, direct look she brought to geological truth. "I know the ground." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the scar on her palm, a gesture so gentle and so specific that she felt it from her palm through her entire chest. And she thought that she had spent her whole career learning to read the Earth's hidden structure, its secret roots and its buried history, and its quiet, stable formations that would hold any weight you trusted to them. She had not known, until a September morning when a mountain fell and she found the way through, that all of that preparation was also practice for this, for finding the hidden root in the human terrain, for recognizing solid ground when she stood on it, for trusting the evidence of what she had found. Outside the foothills house, the Sierra Nevada stood as it had always stood, ancient and immovable and full of passages that the right person, looking carefully enough, could learn to navigate. The stars over the California foothills were the same stars that had been there in September of 1872 when she had walked a company of 63 people through the mountains and found, on the other side, a man who had looked at what she was and loved exactly that. The fire burned low. The notebooks filled. The years moved forward with the patient geological certainty of ground that knows its own depth. And Celia Underwood Whitfield, who had been reading the hidden structure of the world her whole life, sat in the warm light with her husband's hand around her scarred palm and knew, with the precise and scientific certainty of someone who has tested every formation and found it true, that she was standing on the most solid ground she had ever found.